Hey everybody, this is Captain Resurrector. This video contains full game spoilers for Wizardry VI: Bane of the Cosmic Forge. If you want a quick opinion, this is a remarkably ambitious game for the time in many ways, but it's also very difficult, and some parts can be tedious. If you like old school dungeon crawlers, I definitely recommend it. It's just a bit of an acquired taste. With that out of the way, we'll get right down to it. It is the year 3 in the Erdrick Reckoning, and one of the first great RPG series is losing relevance fast. When it first released on the Apple II, Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, was a truly state-of-the-art computer game, with its revolutionary and insanely influential battle system forming the basis for most turn-based multi-character RPGs to this day. It was a smash hit, as ancient Apple II games go anyway, and naturally Surtech got to work pumping out sequels. Now, one of the draws of the Wizardry series was that you could transfer your characters from one game to the next, so the gameplay was essentially unchanged between entries, except for Wizardry IV, the weird one, and some of them also suffered from delays in development and the like. The end result of all this was that by the time they put out Wizardry V: Heart of the Maelstrom, the rest of the RPG world had outgrown the series. Ultima, which debuted at the same time as Wizardry and was its biggest competitor from the start, had undergone years of development and transformation, including its own approach to multi-character combat, a heavier focus on storytelling, and the addition of background music. Several other games with Wizardry-esque first-person exploration had dropped, most notably the Bard's Tale trilogy, Might and Magic 1 and 2, and Pool of Radiance. All of these built on what Wizardry started and boasted full-color graphics in their environments. All of this without even touching on the great things that were beginning in Japan. And meanwhile, here's Wizardry V, made in an engine as old as Donkey Kong. An engine with black and white wireframe walls for all environments. An engine where dead characters stay dead, and if all your characters die, you have to roll a new party and start over. Enter D.W. Bradley. Bradley cut his teeth designing RPGs by co-creating Wizardry V, along with Andrew Greenberg, one of the creators of the first game. Now, in Erdrick Reckoning Year 5, with that experience under his belt, he was put in charge of designing the sequel, and this time he determined to make the new game stick out from all the others before it. For starters, the 6th Wizardry would have no connection to the first 5 plot-wise, taking place in an all-new setting. More importantly, it would boast detailed, modern, full-color graphics, allowing deeper immersion and helping it stay up-to-date with games like Might and Magic 2. He also overhauled the game's mechanics, introducing a new skill system and roughly doubling the number of races and classes to choose from. The result of all these improvements was Wizardry VI: Bane of the Cosmic Forge, and the connected trilogy of games that it spawned. My personal history with Wizardry is pretty limited, and I'm fairly certain it didn't want me to play it. I started playing this one a while back, before I had a YouTube channel, and I played a good 5 hours of it before promptly catching COVID. I was way too sick to be mapping dungeons and solving riddles, so I dropped the game to play something less thinky while I recovered. I ended up playing E6 instead, which, here's my review of E6, it rocks, go play it. I started over with a new party to make this review, and then towards the end my computer crapped out and I had to get it fixed. I'm convinced this game is cursed. All of that to say, this was my first time ever really playing, let alone beating, a Wizardry game. Though I have played a few heavily Wizardry-inspired games before, in particular the Etrian Odyssey remake, which also rocks and you should play it too, but I digress. The character creation and customization in Wizardry VI is its main draw, and also easily the most intimidating aspect for a new player. It's incredibly rich with options, in that sort of way where you just know you're gonna mess up and screw yourself out of something you need. The first thing you have to do is open the manual, read it, reread it, go cross-eyed at all the tables and tables explaining races, classes, attribute requirements, spell books, skill points. Then you have to come up with a theoretically balanced party for a difficult game you've never played, hoping you don't miss out on anything crucial or waste skill points on anything useless. Then, once you've planned out your party, you have to sit down for hours, rolling and re-rolling characters until you get insanely high attribute rolls. And even after you do all that, just know the early game will have you dying every couple of fights anyway. For the record, the one thing I sorta cheated on was rolling the characters. I used save states to re-roll them faster. Here are the basics of the system as well as I understand them. You pick from a variety of races to set your character's minimum stats, and I think some races have other little bonuses and saving throws. You get your standard fantasy fare of humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, hobbits, and fairies, and also a few new beastly races invented for this setting. Lizardmen, Drakons, Felpers, Rawwolves, and Mooks. Definitely not Wookiees, by the way. Unfortunately, most of these new races feel somewhat apart from the setting, since there are no characters of these races you meet in the game, except for a few minor lizardman enemies. This can be easily explained away, since the game takes place in a pretty small, secluded area, and maybe all the Felpers just live in another kingdom or something. On the other hand, demons feature prominently in the story, and you can't play as a demon, which is lame. It's kind of like Ultima 2 in that way, with the disappointing lack of playable orcs. Once you pick a race and sex, which together set your base stats, the game rolls a random number of points you spend on higher stats. Now you get to pick a profession, each with different skills, starting equipment, and for some of them, spellbooks. You get your basic fighter and thief, 4 kinds of spellcaster for the 4 spellbooks, bards which are actually insanely good, believe it or not, and a bunch of fancier variants of the basic classes that have their own special skills. To qualify for a profession, you need your stats high enough, and each class has different requirements, so if you want a good class, you need to get lucky with your bonus points while rolling the character, or else get lucky when you level up and change your class later. Lastly, you get a few points to spend on skills. Some skills increase with use, for instance the skills for the different weapon types, while some only go up if you spend points on them when you level up, like studying your spellbook. You definitely want to make sure you know which is which, so you save your points for the skills that really need them. Here's my party. First there's Kriemhilde, a dwarven Valkyrie, which is a sort of paladin type character with heavy equipment and a bit of priest magic. Then Grach, the Drakon Samurai, which can have mage spells, but I wanted him for the Kirijutsu skill, which lets you insta-kill enemies with a lucky attack. Then there's Pyotr, the gnomish priest, which is your typical healer, Angelo the elvish bard, which does all the things a thief can do but gets magical instruments, and his sister Diavola the mage, which gets attack magic. My favorite character I came up with is easily the fairy ninja Nightshade. Both fairies and ninja get a huge boost to their evasion, and I believe those boosts stack. Fairies can't hold a lot of weight, but ninjas fight with their bare hands anyway, and they have Kirijutsu, so I like to imagine Nightshade zipping around in the air, dodging everything, and then swooping in and snapping somebody's neck. It's really funny to me. As a side note, your characters are all given a random age about 18 to 21 years old, and apparently they actually do age up very slowly when you sleep. I thought this would be something to worry about, especially if I want to take my party with me to the next 2 games, but I slept whenever I needed to all game long and they never went up a year, so it's definitely balanced to get you through the trilogy with plenty of wiggle room. The quest begins in a ruined castle, which was ruled more than a century ago by an evil king who studied black magic. Dissatisfied with his earthly dominion, he allied with a powerful wizard, calling on demonic powers and bending them to his own purposes. In their search for greater power, the two discovered the Cosmic Forge, a magical pen of unknown origin with the power to make anything written with it come true. Using the forge, they ruled for a time, but soon the kingdom was destroyed, and there is no one left alive who knows how the tragedy occurred. You play as a band of adventurers who has just arrived in the castle, seeking to discover what became of the Cosmic Forge, and perhaps to take it for themselves. As you enter the castle, the front gates close shut behind you, ensuring there is no way out of this forbidding place except forward. There's an immediate sense of claustrophobia, provided by the deathly quiet, the relative lack of safe spaces like shops and inns, and the ominous warning scrawled inside one of the first treasure chests you find. Beware the narrow corridors of the mind. Ow. There's no music in this game, the sound design instead focusing on skittering and thumping sounds, letting you know the ruins are by no means abandoned, and providing a subtle ambience. Ow! About as subtle and ambient as Keith Moon playing on an Ed, Edd n Eddy soundboard. Let's take a moment to appreciate the upgrade in graphics here. Where the first 5 wizardries had only blank black walls, here there are ancient, dimly lit halls of carven stone, continuing well into the dark past your limited eyesight. The doorways have little gargoyle faces on top of them, grinning as if mocking you. There are candles on the walls flickering in the damp air, and when you look off the side of the castle's towers, a pitch-black abyss yawns as far as you can see. Even before we get into any of the beautifully written flavor text or the dark underbelly of the story that gets revealed later, the game is dripping with an atmosphere of gothic horror. Wait, did I say these were the castle graphics? Sorry about that, I was showing you the pyramid area. And here's what the mountain looks like. And the enchanted forest. Yeah, I'm just gonna get the biggest flaw with the game out of the way. They upgraded the graphics to look like a castle, and it's perfect for the opening area, but they didn't have either the money or the disk space to make different tile sets for the other areas. This really hurts the suspension of disbelief as the game goes on. Sure, you had to use your imagination in the older games too, but there you had blank walls you could easily project your imagination onto. These look specifically like castle walls, even when they're supposed to be mountainsides or trees. And don't get it twisted, this isn't a sure it's dated now, but it was good for the time situation. This was lousy the day it came out, just look at the Bard's Tale. The town looks like a town, the dungeons look like dungeons. Still, for now the graphics set the perfect tone, and the dungeon design is incredible. This castle is one of the most memorable opening areas I've ever played in an RPG, and in fact it's probably the best part of the game. The whole thing is laid out believably as a large, multi-storied rectangle with spires in the four corners as well as a few in the middle. There are sensibly laid out hallways leading between rooms, each of which has a reasonable function, and anytime you enter a room you get some flavor text describing the scenery, and sometimes drip-feeding you rumors of the history of the castle that your characters had presumably heard before starting their adventure. Like you'll just go through the door to the throne room, and you can practically hear a really excited DM reading this to you. Fibrous shreds of stained rot cling to the walls where colorful tapestry once proclaimed sovereignty in this official chamber. With grim mockery, the sweeter taste of a mighty throne perched high above the room has long turned sour, as it sits condemned to languish in its own final sentence. If there is any last judgment to be decreed upon this fallen chamber and tarnished throne, it must be gleaned from the decay that it laps upon its own dais as itself festers and rots, bearing witness to emptiness, filth, and stench, silently weeping tears of its own despoiled substance. Most of this first area is a process of exploring as far as you can in one direction, hitting a roadblock, then looking somewhere else, figuring things out and leveling up as you go. You might try going up this tower, for instance, and find a locked door at the top. Later on, you'll find a matching key and find a zombie boss inside who mops the floor with you in seconds. Now, you could grind, but you're better off trying all the other places you haven't explored yet, and eventually you come back and beat the zombie. The lockpicking mechanic acts to keep you from discovering everything right away. You have to level up a bit and put skill points into skullduggery first, but once you do, you can run around unlocking all the plain doors in the castle, and as you pick weaker locks, your skill goes up, letting you pick stronger locks. As you go through this process, the sordid details of the royal family's home life are revealed bit by bit, fleshing out the manual's bare-bones backstory. You pick this lock and you enter a servant girl's bedroom, with some text telling you the unconfirmed rumors that the king snuck into her bed every night when she was only 14, and that the queen never could prove it because he could supposedly walk through walls. Later you find the king's bedroom, and in it is a secret passageway which leads to the servant girl's room around the back. The queen was right, but then she doesn't have much room to talk, since you can go in her bedroom and find her secret closet full of BDSM gear, which the narrator helpfully explains was for her peculiar rituals with young men. It's fascinating to see such an old game use environmental storytelling like this, and the sense of intrigue as you slowly uncover the dark secret life behind the royal facade makes a great motivator to keep exploring. In the basement, you can go in this room to hear the Street Fighter pause noise. Here you meet the merchant Queequeg, your one armor shop for the beginning of the game, and also your one friendly face to ask for hints. This is one of the more ambitious aspects of the game. You can speak to friendly NPCs like Queequeg and they respond to full sentences. Though I didn't experience this mechanic myself, they also apparently give consequences to your actions. For instance, you can try to steal from them, and if you do, they'll remember what you did and stop being friendly to you. You also have the option to fight every NPC in the game, killing them permanently, giving you only the bare minimum items that you need to win the game, but locking you out of buying from them. This makes playing an evil party sort of a hard mode option. I've played nice with everybody on this playthrough, but it adds some real freedom in decision making. The castle isn't that big, but you spend a lot of time zigzagging around finding items to let you pass puzzles in a chain, like an old adventure game. It's the sort of thing where you find the cheese to use at the mouse hole, to get the stuffed Snoopy toy, to give to the guy who lost it, to get the key, to find the other key, to go to the altar, to do a ritual, to drop down to the back of the castle, to find the pirate's log, to tell Queequeg where the treasure is so he'll tell you the password so you can meet the pirates and beat them in a drinking contest, so you can take the captain's hook so you can tie it to a rope so you can cross the chasm to the next area, and I'm sure I left out a bunch of steps. And of course, the whole time you're figuring this out, you're getting into random encounters. The combat is arguably the Wizardry series' biggest contribution to the game industry, and it caught on for good reason. Battles are turn-based, and you begin every turn by choosing actions for all of your characters, like attacking, using a spell, or parrying. Your characters are set up in 2 rows of 3, and your characters may or may not be able to attack the enemy based on which row you're in, how long your weapon is, and how far from the front the enemy is. Spells are long range, of course, and they often damage a whole group of monsters, aside from other crucial effects like buffs, debuffs, healing, and so on. Your spells are divvied up into 6 elements, each with a separate pool of magic points, so you can end up in situations where you're using ice on a monster that's weak to fire because you already used up all your fire spells. The bard gets to use magical instruments that basically act as free, unlimited use spells. The loot you start with is a free sleep spell, and the castle area would be a billion times harder without it. I also love that one of the instruments you can get is a harmonium. Am I supposed to fit that in my pocket? There's also a whole system of different types of attacks with different damage levels, chances to hit, and chances to penetrate armor. This level of detail is impressive, but I ended up just using whichever attack is on top of the menu, since it usually gets the job done at the start, and as your characters get better with their weapons, they get multiple attacks per turn, and they just mix and match the different attack types anyway. There's all kinds of subtle mechanics going on under the hood, with your character and the enemies not only having an invasion stat, but also individual chances that each body part deflects a blow if it lands. This leads to a lot of fights early on looking a bit silly, with you and your enemies swinging and missing over and over, until somebody gets hit and drops dead. Oh, and you will drop dead. Death is frequent and usually sudden, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it except reload your save. Good thing you can reload a save in this game, it's the first wizardry without permadeath. Except, that's not technically true. You can always reload a save to get around it, but there is technically a permadeath mechanic in Wizardry VI. If your whole party gets bodied in a fight, or falls in a pit for that matter, you get booted back to the title screen. But if one of your characters dies and you resurrect them, their vitality stat gets permanently reduced by 1. Now, your vitality can still go up normally when you level up, but otherwise there's no way to restore it. And if a character's vitality ever hits 0, they're just dead. So your best bet is to never allow anyone to die without reloading your save, that way your vitality never goes down and you don't have to worry about it. Still, that means playing an entire Tough as Nails RPG, never allowing yourself to lose a character. To put that into perspective, this relatively player-friendly sequel that made the death rules much easier than its predecessors still ends up giving you less leeway than the old-school Megami Tensei games. Let that sink in. Between the fights and the picky inventory puzzles, which will only get more obtuse with time, Wizardry VI is very difficult. Oh, and there is a hard mode in case it's not hardcore enough for you. To my knowledge, all it does is add one more enemy to every group. So your random encounters are harder, but the real stroke of evil genius is that it applies to bosses too. Like you literally have to fight 2 of the final boss at the same time. I'm sure there's people way better at wizardry than me who beat it on hard all the time, but I wasn't about to try it on my first playthrough, it's tough enough as it is. Eventually, you find your way out of the castle and enter this big open area with canyons everywhere and a mountain in the distance. Off to the side there are a couple of caves that lead to a tightly interwoven series of mine tunnels patrolled by dwarves. I've gotta say, the strength of the dungeon design really shines through here. It's seriously a masterclass. You genuinely get a sense of very different outdoor, cave, and castle areas through nothing more than level geometry and a few judicious bits of flavor text, and that careful attention to appropriate map design carries on through the rest of the game. It's just a shame the endless stone walls work against the effect. This game could have been seriously immersive otherwise. Oh, real quick, listen to the noise the giants make. Yeah. The mines themselves are a densely intertwined 3-dimensional maze, the sort that's tricky to navigate even with a map. The main goal of the place is this room on the bottom floor with 4 entrances from the 4 cardinal directions, each of which is blocked by an invisible wall which lets you see a wizard trapped inside. You have to hit each wall with a miner's chisel to crack it and set the wizard free, but it's not quite that simple. I got stuck here, and I don't know whether you have to hit all the walls multiple times, or in a specific order, or what, but I had to run around hitting all the walls over and over until the game decided I could get through, and it's not like all the entrances are right next to each other either. You really have to zigzag all over the map to get from one side of the room to another. The reward for dealing with the chisel puzzle is the first big plot dump of the game, the first indication that the stuff about the wizard and the king isn't just window dressing. This is Zorphitus, the wizard from the backstory, or at least he's half of Zorphitus. It turns out there is a curse on the Cosmic Forge, stating that the forge can only write on something called the Cosmic Circle. If anybody uses the pen outside the circle, then whatever they write will still come true, but they will suffer their wish as a bane. They said the thing! And they will only be freed of the bane after a generation passes. Zorphitus thought he was being clever, and wrote that he would have knowledge of all things, which would naturally include any possible way around the curse. But as he discovered, this universe works on yin-yang rules, and all knowledge is divided. So his bane is that he was split into two beings, each with knowledge of good or evil, but not both. He warns you that perfect knowledge, an unclouded vision of the truth, is impossible, and that at some point you will have to deal with his evil half. The wizard's corpse holds a key to his cave right next to the mines, and in here you meet a talking snake named Mr. Fafas. He was Zorphitus' apprentice, and he has a thing for the queen. One day he snuck in and used the forge to make himself attractive to the queen and also safe from the king's jealousy, hoping that he could be part of her harem. Well, the queen is a sucker for reptiles, so he ended up as her pet snake. He tells you that there's death underneath the castle, whatever that means, and that the wizard sealed the death away with a door that you need 2 gems to open. Meanwhile, while you're uncovering the nature of the forge and starting to piece together what happened to the realm, you're also piecing together what you're supposed to do. This is about where the puzzles started grating on me. There are a few side areas that you don't actually need, like everything you can get with the hidden key of A minor. The problem is, you can't tell what is or isn't required until the game is over, since there are many minor seeming items that are 100% necessary. Case in point, here's a button to lower a drawbridge, and it's stuck. I searched everywhere I could get to in this whole area and found nothing that would fix the button. Eventually I gave in and looked at a guide, which if I'm being honest I did more times than I'd like to admit, and you need to use oil on it. Oil that only Queequeg has, so I had to run all the way back and buy it from him to move on. The bridge lets you climb a mountain to get boulders, which you need to shoot out of a catapult to lower another bridge that lets you go to the next part of the game. But see, the catapult is broken. It has a rusty sprocket, which you obviously take to the friendly dwarf in the mines who offers to fix anything you find. That's super straightforward, but also while I was running around mapping the mines and finding all the ways to the wizard room, there were these little nooks that I ignored which have one-time fights with rubber beasts. You have to run around fighting them, killing them for their rubber. Then you have to go into your inventory, shuffle your stuff around so that you have 4 rubbers on one character, and merge them all together into a rubber band, which you then use on the catapult along with the fixed sprocket, and then, after all that, you shoot a boulder, and there's a % chance that you miss the target anyway, and you have to either reload or go get more boulders off the mountain. I don't think I can write a better critique of the puzzle system than I did in my notes immediately after fixing the catapult, so I'm just going to read that now. I think I'm starting to come to terms with really disliking the approach to puzzle solving. You're offered a rich tapestry of options, tons of items, spells, etc., a seemingly rich role-playing mechanic in the typed-out NPC conversations. There are a few things that offer freedom, like whether to pick, force, or spell lock doors, options for killing NPCs and still having the game winnable, etc. But in the end, this level of freedom is illusory for the puzzles, which all seem to involve finding very specific items, using them in very specific ways to the point of analness with the chisel puzzle, in very specific places, many of which aren't particularly signposted as being important until much later after you find them. The rubber beasts, the cheese, I have a wine bottle I'm still lugging around, do I need it? So many items, and you never know when or even whether they will be the one way forward. You're left to wonder every few steps which one of the myriad doodads in your 6 separate inventories is the one you want, or whether you need to find some out-of-the-way nook to get one. It's beginning to look like I'll have to go through the whole game with a guide if I want to win sometime this decade, and I was really hoping not to do that. Finally, you climb another mountain, fight this rock guy to take the first gem, and you get dumped in an ancient pyramid where you— Whoa! Hey, how you doing? Right out of nowhere, about halfway through the game, you get this area full of topless Zulu warrior women. The graphics weren't really there to make them that attractive yet, but I see the vision. It's kind of funny to me. This game came out before the ESRB existed, and there's no nudity whatsoever until several hours in, and all of a sudden the game is covered in titties. And spoilers, it stays that way. I think they figured anybody too young to see pixel boobs wouldn't make it this far, which is a fair assumption. The pyramid is a relatively small area, with some trial and error puzzles involving finding the right button combinations to avoid instant death traps. In a previous Wizardry, this would have been the worst part of the game, but with save scumming it's a fun little set piece. The enemies get pretty hard here, especially the priestesses with their obnoxious spells, which led to me finding a whole new way to die. I can't even get mad at that shit's funny. At the top, you meet the Amazulu Queen and her High Priestess. The Queen says their god, Malmumu, the Guardian of the Rock, demands a sacrifice, and if you refuse to give her anything, or let it slip that you're after the rock, she attacks you. Of course you need the rock, but I decided to play it friendly with them. I wonder what happens if you hit on her. That's your opinion. Girl, get some self-confidence, you're the literal queen! Now you can walk over to the Pool of Fire and fight Malmumu for the second gem. You know, now that I think of it, you kinda screw over the Amazulu either way. Who, me? Here to take the rock? No, I'm just here to give your god an offering, don't mind me. Then I kill him and they don't realize he's dead yet when I leave. What happens to them now? Was Malmumu protecting them or something? Is the priestess out of a job? Back in the castle basement, past the door with the gems, you meet Charon and take a ride down the river Styx. This is a long, winding corridor that wraps around on itself, dotted with islands and caves on the shore that all lead to mini-dungeons. This is the closest any of the areas has been to being visually distinct, flying around over a vast expanse of water like this. There are plenty more inventory puzzles, including finally using that random wine bottle from earlier. The enemies really kick it up a notch at this point, more or less requiring you to heal up at these fountains and use all the buff spells you know before doing anything. This was where I finally resorted to experimenting a little with the class-changing system. At any time, you can change a character's class in the menu, with the only restriction being that they must have the minimum stats needed for that profession. When you change classes, you get to keep all your skill points and spells, including ones the new class otherwise couldn't use, plus you start over at level 1, allowing you to rack up skill points all over again at a faster rate. However, there's one downside that makes it easy to screw up. All of your stats are lowered to the minimum for your race or class, whichever is higher. This means, if you already know all the best skills, you can plan ahead a route through all the classes you need, picking races and sexes for your characters that make the stat requirements reasonable. However, if you're playing for the first time and winging it, trying to get whatever good stuff you can, it's easy to get stuck in a class you don't want, unable to get the right rolls when you level up. A mild version of this happened to me when I was flip-flopping Pyotr between two types of spellcaster. I wanted to give him one more run as a psionic to get the Mind Flay spell, but I just didn't have the numbers for it. I had to save scum levels a little bit to keep Diavola from getting stuck as an alchemist too. I've heard tales of expert wizardry players going the whole game reloading after they level up, over and over, to make their party grow the way they need them to, and while you'll find crazy people doing that sort of thing with any RPG, this is a rare example where it's actually worth the effort. I honestly think this system would benefit from having some rare stat-raising items, like the seeds from Dragon Quest, to give the player some leeway. Flip-flopping like this is the only way to put enough skill points into magic to get the best spells, by the way, though some of the really high spells didn't do much for me, in particular Nuclear Blast, which is supposed to be the strongest attack spell that mages get, but it never seemed to hit anything. The Styx section culminates in the Hall of the Dead, which is basically just a linear combat gauntlet with the world's cutest big scary spiders. I mean, look at them. Anyway, the whole place is a catacomb, with graves holding optional bosses that give you great equipment. This samurai boss was probably the hardest in the game. I had to spend a whole turn using every buff and debuff I could think of and hope for lucky rolls to leave me at least half alive before I could attack, and that's with a crowd of samurai and ninja enemies, both of which can insta-kill just like the playable ones. That Muramasa blade is well worth it though. In the catacombs, you actually meet the king and queen, the king being a vampire because he used the cosmic forge to wish for immortality, and the queen being a vengeful spirit. Basically, during his conquest, the king made a pact with a demon to gain its dark power, and in exchange he performed a ritual to allow the demon to mate with a human, who is actually the zombie boss from way at the start of the game, by the way, making a half-demon daughter named Rebecca. According to the queen, the king then raised Rebecca and used her for her magic, eventually lusting after her as she grew older and choosing her over his own wife. The queen depicts Rebecca as a callous, demonic seductress who stole her man and even had her own mother executed. and she demands that you kill the two of them and exact her revenge, with a warning not to trust anything they say. This is the point where it all comes together. The running theme of humanity stumbling blindly with imperfect knowledge, from Zorfidus' warning, the unpredictable side effects of the Bane, and back to the first message in the game, culminates in one big decision for the player. You're an outsider, thrust into the middle of a cosmic domestic dispute between two deeply untrustworthy people, and told to pick a side. If you take the cross that the Queen gives you, you can kill the king that ruined this place. Or, you can drop the cross and deny the Queen the satisfaction. But who knows what will happen then. In my case, I had no reason to trust either of them, but I also had no reason to kill Rebecca. She was just a kid when this all went down, and she really seems to be the victim in all this. So I dropped the cross and sided with Rebecca and the king. Without the cross, the king bites you, just enough for a snack I guess, and leaves you in a cell. Now, with your choice made and your fate decided, you escape the cell to take on the Temple of Ram. Erected by the king to establish his dominion over the dark forces of the demon realm, the temple shoots high into the sky, leading up to an epic showdown with the evil half of the wizard Zorfidus, and then with the king himself, where the ramifications of your decision will finally be made clear. Was that? Right, sorry, you actually have to do a whole other section before you can get into the temple. You have to explore the, Enchanted Forest, yeah, right. And it involves this whole thing with finding the Fairy Queen, and then this oracle in the dark part of the woods, and it's all twisty and tedious to map, and ugh. Look at this. Look at this random stinking wall I need to push on. It's not even at the end of a corridor or anything. And don't get me started on the rock you have to break with the miner's pick, but what? You thought the miner's chisel might work? What are you, stupid? Yeah, I was seriously ready for the game to be over at this point. Part of it is that this is the longest game I've ever played taking notes for a video, and also my computer broke towards the end of the Hall of the Dead and I had to wait to finish it, but a lot of it is the game itself. Not only is this forest section a huge speed bump right as the story is winding up to its conclusion, but the samey graphics and lack of music make the game feel slower. You really don't appreciate how much the pacing of a game is affected by variety in the visuals and sound until those elements are gone. Sure, Wizardry VI is a good 50 or so hours of pure dungeon crawling on a grid, but so is, say, Etrian Odyssey. I enjoyed Etrian Odyssey all the way through, not on the original difficulty to be clear, I'm not that good. And there was always that subtle motivator that every 5 levels, I would get a big story scene of some kind, then a new area with new backgrounds and music. The change in scenery imparts a subtle psychological sense of progression that you can literally see. Oh, real quick while I'm bellyaching, I have to show you the wrecked ship in the forest. With a plank leading to the shore. Ain't it beautiful? After frolicking with the fairies a bit, you do finally go up and fight Zorfidus, who honestly isn't much tougher than the random encounters in the temple, but then the random encounters here are pretty ridiculous. In his dying moments, he taunts you, saying you will never find the forge because you can't look beyond your own perception, and drops a hint that the cosmic forge isn't magical at all, though he dies before he can tell you what it really is. I do hope this thread is picked up in the sequels and they don't just leave the mystery hanging. His dying speech is a hint that you have to look past the narrow corridors of the mind, or rather the literal narrow corridors of the game world. Past the wall, you meet the king for the last time, as he bemoans his fate, cursed to live as a vampire because of his wish for immortality, and he rams a stake into his own heart, finally free of the Bane now that a generation has passed. Rebecca explains that it was actually the queen who had her mother killed, and in her jealousy used the forge to wish for the death of the demon girl. The forge, in its ironic genie fashion, killed the queen. Oh, and also the queen was sleeping with Zorfidus back in the day, and also banged Rebecca's demon dad and had a son we haven't heard about yet. There's like a whole Shakespeare play's worth of infidelity and backstabbing going on in the background here. At peace with the king's death, Rebecca flies off to find her own destiny. Out of all these mortals caught up in the Forge's bane, playing with powers beyond their understanding, she's the only one that makes it out with her freedom, uncorrupted by the pen's forbidden power. Now, there's one final decision to make. After all that's transpired, you find the cosmic forge itself. Well, do you want it? It's what you came here for, after all. If you take it, the game ends right there with this weird glowing guy swiping the pen. I assume you find out what his deal is in Wizardry VII, but let's be real, unless you're role-playing a party of headstrong idiots, taking the forge makes no sense after you've seen what it does to anyone who uses it. So instead, you can go talk to Rebecca's brother, who is a dragon for some reason. He asks if you want to go fight a cosmic lord with him and takes you on his spaceship. I must say, the conclusion of the King and Rebecca's story is satisfying, but the endings themselves feel like clumsy afterthoughts. They're just so sudden. This whole thing plays out differently if you sided with the Queen. You actually get a whole extra boss battle with the King and Rebecca, then if you forego the pen, you fight the dragon and steal his spaceship. This amounts to 3 different endings, which land you at 3 different beginnings to Wizardry VII if you import your party. From what I've heard, Wizardry VII is a big open-world game, and you actually start the game from different points on the map, and then the multiple endings you get based on your decisions there carry on to Wizardry VIII. That's insanely ambitious, especially for the time, even if the individual endings had to be a bit abrupt to make it work. I've complained about the pacing, the puzzles, and especially the graphics, but past these flaws, Wizardry VI is a great game. It's remarkable for its rich character customization, its challenging battles, its marriage of level design with storytelling, and its focus on moral choices that have consequences that even carry over into the sequel. All of these elements are apparently expanded on significantly in the rest of the trilogy, and I look forward to seeing how the tale of the Cosmic Forge continues. Eventually. Assuming I don't catch COVID this time.